I don't know why we should listen to a backward racist swamp dweller who's never understood what it means to struggle. Representative Maxine Waters' voice thundered through the hearing room, her finger jabbing accusingly toward Senator John Kennedy. The Financial Services Committee hearing had barely begun, and already Waters had abandoned all pretense of procedure, launching immediately into a personal attack that left the audience gasping. Let me make something crystal clear to everyone here. Waters continued, her voice rising with each word. This man sitting across from me is nothing but a caricature, a fake Southern gentleman act designed to hide his contempt for working people. The people of California deserve better than to be lectured by someone who represents everything wrong with politics today. The hearing room erupted in chaos. Waters' supporters, strategically positioned throughout the gallery, cheered and applauded, while committee members exchanged shocked glances. Some Republicans began to protest, but Waters, wielding her chairwoman's gavel with authority, silenced them immediately. I am speaking, she declared, banging the gavel 3 times. And it's about time someone told the truth about Senator Kennedy. This was supposed to be a routine hearing on banking regulations, but Waters had orchestrated something entirely different, a public humiliation of a political opponent she had long despised. Her staff had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering clips, quotes, and carefully edited materials designed to make Kennedy look foolish. Your fake Oxford degree doesn't fool me, Senator, Waters sneered, emphasizing the word senator with dripping contempt. We all know it was bought and paid for by your corporate handlers. You may have fooled the people of Louisiana with your aw shucks routine, but this committee sees right through you. Kennedy sat quietly at his designated spot, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. His face betrayed nothing, no anger, no embarrassment, just the slight hint of a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. To those watching, he appeared either completely unfazed or totally blindsided. Most assumed the latter. A young aide whispered something in Waters' ear, and she nodded with satisfaction. I'm being told our live stream already has 50,000 viewers, she announced proudly. America is finally seeing the truth about John Kennedy. Waters had prepared for this moment meticulously. A large screen behind her flashed to life, displaying a PowerPoint presentation with Kennedy's face edited onto a cartoon character in overalls chewing on a piece of straw. The gallery erupted in laughter. Don't let that swamp drawl fool you, folks, Waters proclaimed, gesturing to the screen. This act has gone on long enough. She played a heavily edited video montage of Kennedy's past statements, cut and rearranged to make him sound foolish and contradictory. The clips jumped from one hearing to another, sentences spliced together to create meanings Kennedy had never intended. Her staff had worked overnight on the presentation, and they beamed proudly from behind her as the audience reacted with gasps and laughter. Here he is, defending billionaires while claiming to represent working people. Waters narrated as the clips rolled. Here he is, questioning an African-American nominee with that condescending tone he reserves for people of color. The video ended with a clip of Kennedy stumbling slightly over his words during a late-night Senate session, looped 3 times for maximum effect. The Democratic side of the committee dais erupted in laughter. What's wrong, Senator? Waters taunted, as Kennedy continued to write calmly in his notepad. Cat got your tongue, or did you forget your script today? Maybe your handlers didn't prepare you for someone who isn't intimidated by your act. Kennedy adjusted his reading glasses, made another note, and took a sip of water. His complete calm seemed to irritate Waters even more. Look at him, too afraid to respond, she exclaimed, pointing dramatically. The great orator of Louisiana suddenly mute when confronted with the truth. She played another clip, this one doctored to make it appear Kennedy had made racist remarks during a committee hearing the previous year. The editing was subtle but effective, cutting away just before Kennedy had qualified his statement with context that completely changed its meaning. "This is who the people of Louisiana chose to represent them," Waters declared. "A man who can't even defend himself when his own words are played back to him." Several of Kennedy's Republican colleagues looked ready to intervene, but Kennedy himself made a small gesture with his hand, asking them to wait. He continued taking notes, seemingly unbothered by the onslaught. For nearly 20 minutes, Waters continued her barrage, breaking every rule of decorum, while her supporters live-streamed the takedown. The hashtag Kennedy Roasted was already trending on social media. Waters' digital team posted clips in real time, celebrating what they saw as a definitive political assassination. "Senator Kennedy represents everything wrong with the Republican Party." Waters continued now, pacing dramatically in front of the dais. "The fake folksy manner, hiding cruel policies. The pretend humility, masking arrogance. The rehearsed one-liners designed to go viral while saying nothing of substance." She approached Kennedy's table, standing directly in front of him. "Your routine might work back in Louisiana, Senator, but here in Washington, we need serious people who understand policy, not carnival barkers with clever catchphrases." A staffer handed Waters a tablet, which she held up triumphantly. "The New York Times is already covering this hearing live," she announced. The headline reads, "Waters exposes Kennedy's facade. How does it feel to have your act finally revealed, Senator?" Kennedy simply turned to a fresh page in his legal pad and continued writing. This studied nonchalance clearly wasn't the reaction Waters had anticipated, and for the first time a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She recovered quickly, however, turning to address the packed room. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what privilege looks like. When confronted with his own words, with his own record, Senator Kennedy believes he can simply ignore the questions, that he's somehow above accountability." She leaned toward Kennedy, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that the microphone still captured perfectly. "That might work with the good old boys back home, but not here, Senator. Not today." Finally, Waters delivered what she believed would be her coup de grace. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Senator? Or are you just going to hide behind your white privilege and that fake Southern drawl?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Kennedy. The moment stretched uncomfortably as everyone waited for his response. With deliberate slowness, Kennedy set down his pen. He removed his reading glasses, folded them carefully, and placed them on the table. He stood up, straightened his slightly rumpled suit, and cleared his throat. "Chairwoman Waters," he began, his Louisiana accent measured and mild. "My mama taught me never to argue with someone who's putting on a show. But you've said so many inaccurate things, I feel I should clarify a few points." He opened a thick folder that had been sitting on the table in front of him. The folder was filled with color-coded tabs and meticulous documentation. Several of Waters' staffers exchanged nervous glances as Kennedy arranged his papers with unhurried precision. "You know," Kennedy continued, his voice gentle but carrying throughout the now silent room, "my grandpappy used to say that the louder someone yells, the less they usually have to say. I've been sitting here wondering why you're yelling so loud today, Chairwoman Waters." He looked directly at her for the first time since she began her attack. "But I think I might have figured it out." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Waters' confident smile faltered just slightly. Something in Kennedy's calm demeanor suggested he wasn't as unprepared as she had assumed. For the first time, some of her supporters in the gallery looked uncertain, as if suddenly realizing the show might not follow the script they had anticipated. I want to thank you for that colorful speech. Kennedy began, his tone conversational and unhurried. Chairwoman Waters clearly cares deeply about ethics in politics. So let's talk about ethics. I think we might find some common ground there. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing the calm confidence in Kennedy's voice. This was not the defensive posture they had expected. With a subtle nod to a staff member, Kennedy had the chamber's display screen switch from Waters' cartoon mockery to a series of financial figures and property records. The transition was jarring from childish humor to serious documentation. It's mighty interesting to see a public servant with a salary of $174,000 owning a home in Windsor Square valued at $4.8 million, Kennedy said, his folksy drawl belying the precision of his words. Now, I'm just a simple country lawyer, but those numbers don't quite add up in my head. That's quite a mortgage for a congressional salary. The screen showed aerial photos of Waters' Los Angeles residence, along with property tax assessments and purchase records. Waters' face tightened as she realized the direction Kennedy was taking. This is completely inappropriate. My personal finances are not the subject of this hearing. You have no right to— Well, now that's an interesting position, Kennedy replied, his voice remaining gentle but firm. Considering you just spent 20 minutes discussing my personal background, my accent, and my education. But if we're being sticklers for procedure, he pulled out a document with the committee letterhead. This hearing was called to discuss ethics in banking and government. Says so, right here, in the notice you signed, Madam Chairwoman. He held up the document so the cameras could capture it clearly. Item 3 on your own agenda, examination of potential conflicts of interest in government oversight of banking regulations. It seems like financial discrepancies might be relevant after all. The gallery murmured as Kennedy continued, some of Waters' supporters exchanging uncomfortable glances. Now I have here something that might be of interest. He held up an official-looking document with federal seals visible. This is an IRS report you probably didn't want the public to see. Waters jumped to her feet, her composed demeanor crumbling. I object. This document should be stricken from the record. This is a violation of privacy and— Kennedy smiled gently, cutting her off with a raised hand. This document is completely legal, Madam Chairwoman. The FBI provided it at the committee's request. Your request, actually, when you expanded the committee's investigative powers last year. If you'll recall, you specifically authorized full access to financial records of any individual testifying before this committee. As I'm testifying today, I believe the same standard applies to the committee chair, does it not? He turned to the committee counsel, who nodded reluctantly. The room erupted again, but this time the energy had shifted palpably. Several of Waters' supporters slipped quietly toward the exits, not wanting to be associated with what was unfolding. Let me highlight some interesting numbers, Kennedy continued, unperturbed by the commotion. He used a laser pointer to indicate specific lines in the document displayed on screen. Property holdings in the Bahamas and Caribbean not disclosed on required congressional forms. 3 offshore accounts with deposits totaling $1.2 million between 2018 and 2022. He paused, letting the figures sink in. Now that's a lot of saving on a congressional salary. My mama taught me the value of a penny saved, but this seems exceptional even to her thrifty standards. The room had grown uncomfortably quiet. Kennedy continued with methodical precision. Here we have property records for a beachfront condo in the Bahamas, purchased in 2015 for $970,000. The screen showed beautiful ocean views from a luxury development. Interestingly, this property doesn't appear on any of your financial disclosure forms from 2015 to present. Waters's face had transformed from confident to concerned. Those, those are family investments. Completely legitimate family investments, Kennedy repeated thoughtfully, savoring the phrase. That's an interesting characterization. According to the deed of ownership, this property is held directly in your name, and your husband's not in any family trust or corporate entity. The same applies to the property in St. Kitts, purchased in 2019. Kennedy flipped through several more documents. What's particularly interesting is the timing of these purchases. Each seems to coincide with significant legislative activities of this very committee. He displayed a timeline that correlated Waters' property acquisitions with major banking regulations that had come before her committee. Speaking of family investments, Kennedy continued, his tone shifting slightly. Let's talk about One United Bank. He clicked to display a detailed timeline on the screen. In 2008, One United Bank was in serious financial trouble. Coincidentally, your husband, Sidney Williams, happened to own stock valued at approximately $350,000 in this very bank. Kennedy held up a transcript with official markings. Here's a call between you and then Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson. Interesting timing, just one day after you learned your husband's investment might be wiped out. Waters interjected, her voice less confident than before. Those calls were about helping a minority-owned bank during a financial crisis. This was about protecting community institutions, not personal gain. Is that so? Kennedy asked mildly. He pressed a button on his console, and Waters' own voice filled the room through the chamber speakers. Hank, we need to talk about One United. My husband's investment is at risk. This needs special attention. I know it's not the only bank in trouble, but this one matters personally to me. A hush fell over the room as the recording ended. Waters stared at the audio console in disbelief. That's taken out of context, she sputtered. Perhaps, Kennedy conceded. Let's add some context, then. He played another clip, this time from a 2010 interview where Waters had emphatically denied any personal connection to the bank. I have no financial interest in One United Bank. My advocacy was solely about protecting minority-owned financial institutions. Waters began to respond, but Kennedy wasn't finished. And here, he continued, holding up a printed email with dates and headers clearly visible, is a message from your husband to you, thanking you for saving our investment. Dated the day after One United received $12 million in TARP bailout funds. He read aloud, Maxine, thank you for making the calls we discussed. Our One United shares are safe now. Love, Sidney. Sent December 19th, 2008, at 10:37 a.m. One day after Treasury approved the TARP funds. The room had gone completely silent. Even Waters's most loyal staffers looked uncomfortable, some studying their phones intently or whispering urgently to each other. Kennedy adjusted his glasses. But perhaps this is all circumstantial. Maybe there's an innocent explanation for these coincidences. That's why I thought it might be helpful to hear from someone with direct knowledge. He gestured toward the side door. We have a special guest today. The door opened, and a distinguished middle-aged black man in a tailored suit entered. Kennedy introduced him. This is Marcus Johnson, former Vice President of Operations at One United Bank from 2007 to 2010. Johnson approached the witness table with measured steps. After being sworn in, he addressed the committee. I was present at 3 separate meetings where Representative Waters personally intervened to ensure One United received preferential treatment for bailout funds. In one meeting in November 2008, she explicitly mentioned her husband's financial stake in the bank and told us, and I quote, This needs to happen quickly and quietly. She specifically instructed us not to record these discussions in the official minutes of the meeting. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Johnson continued, "I came forward because I believe in ethical governance. What happened wasn't about helping a minority-owned bank. It was about protecting personal investments at taxpayer expense." Waters tried to interrupt, half rising from her seat. "This is outrageous. I have the right to cross-examine this witness. This is a setup." "Madam Chairwoman," Kennedy interjected gently, "according to Committee Rule 7B, which you yourself modified last year, members may not interrupt witness testimony until they have completed their statement. I'm simply following your rules, which state," he held up the committee rule book, "all witnesses shall be permitted to complete their testimony without interruption from committee members." I believe those were your exact words when you proposed this change. Several committee members couldn't suppress their smiles at seeing Waters caught in her own procedural trap. Republican members exchanged knowing glances, while several Democrats studied their papers, avoiding eye contact with their chairwoman. After Johnson completed his testimony with several more damning details, Kennedy thanked him and turned back to the screen. "I think it might be helpful to examine the contrast between public statements and private actions," he said. Kennedy played a split-screen video on one side. Waters passionately condemning politicians with conflicts of interest during various hearings and interviews. On the other, documentation of her actions regarding One United, her property acquisitions, and offshore accounts. In one particularly striking juxtaposition, Waters was shown saying, "Politicians who use their position for personal gain are a disgrace to public service," followed immediately by documentation of her intervention for One United and the resulting preservation of her husband's investments. It's fascinating to see the difference between what you say and what you do. Kennedy observed, his voice carrying no malice, just a gentle observation. "Down in Louisiana, we have a name for that. We call it having it both ways. Or sometimes just plain hypocrisy." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "My granddaddy used to say, 'Watch what people do, not what they say.' It's advice that served me well over the years." Waters sat stunned. Her earlier confidence entirely evaporated. On a nearby screen, she could see that her live stream viewership had plummeted from over 50,000 to barely 7,000. The hashtag #WatersExposed had overtaken her planned #KennedyRoasted campaign, trending nationwide within minutes. "But perhaps I'm being unfair," Kennedy said, his tone thoughtful. "Everyone makes mistakes. The question is whether these were isolated incidents or part of a pattern." He reached for another folder, this one thicker than the first, with bright red tabs visible along the edges. "Now," Kennedy said, opening this new folder with deliberate care, "shall we move on to family contracts? I believe that might shed some additional light on the pattern we're beginning to see." Waters visibly paled as she recognized the label on the folder, "Waters Family Business Connections, 2010-2023. Kennedy adjusted his glasses and smiled warmly at Waters, whose expression had transformed from smug confidence to barely concealed panic. "Chairwoman Waters, you once said that family comes first. I completely agree. My family taught me honesty and integrity. What did your family teach you about federal contracting?" The gallery erupted in nervous laughter. Waters gripped her gavel tightly, but said nothing. "Let me share something interesting I found," Kennedy continued. "In 2020, your daughter Karen received a campaign consulting contract worth $750,000. Mighty generous. But what's really interesting is the timing. Kennedy displayed documents on the screen. Her company, Progressive Connections LLC, was incorporated just 3 days before receiving this contract. Now, I'm no expert in business formation, but that seems efficient. Waters found her voice. My daughter runs a legitimate business with years of political experience. A legitimate business, Kennedy repeated thoughtfully, with no employees, no office beyond a P.O. box, and no previous clients. That's remarkable entrepreneurship. When Waters began to protest, Kennedy continued, but the most interesting part is this. He displayed a technical document. The IP address used to register the company website matches the IP address of your personal home computer, Chairwoman Waters. The color drained from Waters's face. Still, perhaps this was all coincidental, Kennedy mused. Let's listen to this recording from your office staff meeting, shall we? He pressed play, and Waters's unmistakable voice filled the room. I don't care how you structure it. Just make sure Karen gets that contract. Find a way to make it legal. I don't care how you do it. Waters leapt to her feet. This is illegal. Who authorized recording my office? Kennedy smiled gently. This recording comes from a former staff member of yours, perfectly legal, under D.C.'s one-party consent law. Interesting that you are more concerned about the legality of the recording than its contents. Several reporters quietly slipped out of the room, rushing to file breaking stories. Waters' remaining staffers huddled together, whispering urgently. Now, Kennedy said, let's talk about what you've done for your constituents while arranging these family contracts. The screen changed to show deteriorating conditions in California's 43rd District Waters District for over 30 years. Statistics displayed declining economic indicators, rising crime rates, and failing schools. These are your constituents, Chairwoman Waters, Kennedy said softly, the people you swore to represent. He played video interviews with Waters's constituents. I haven't seen Representative Waters in our neighborhood in 15 years, said an elderly woman. She only shows up when she needs votes. My business was looted during the riots, explained a middle-aged man. Her office never returned our calls asking for help. Waters attempted to interrupt, but Kennedy pressed on. I find it interesting that while your district suffers, you've been quite comfortable. The screen displayed images of Waters at luxury resorts and high-end fundraisers. I wonder if your constituents know that while they struggle with poverty, you're staying at the Four Seasons for $1,000 a night, Kennedy asked, his voice gentle but penetrating. Waters stared down at her papers, unable to meet anyone's eye. You know, Kennedy continued, my grandmama had a saying, tend to your own garden before complaining about your neighbor's weeds. Your garden, Chairwoman Waters, has been sorely neglected. The chamber was completely silent. Even Democratic committee members were studiously avoiding eye contact with Waters. Her once bustling social media live stream had dwindled to a fraction of its initial viewers. Kennedy closed his folder with deliberate care. Shall we continue to round 3? I believe we should discuss your calls to action and their consequences. Kennedy took a slow sip of water and removed his reading glasses. When he spoke again, his exaggerated Southern accent had noticeably diminished, and his tone carried a new gravity that silenced the murmurs in the hearing room. I'd like to talk about the responsibility of leadership during times of crisis, he said, his voice clear and measured. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us, the ultimate measure of a person is not where they stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but where they stand at times of challenge and controversy. The shift in Kennedy's demeanor was palpable. Gone was the folksy, genial persona that had characterized his earlier questioning. In its place stood a serious statesman addressing matters of profound importance. Waters shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing the change in Kennedy's approach. Several Democratic committee members exchanged uneasy glances, aware that they were witnessing a masterclass in political dismantling. Chairwoman Waters, Kennedy continued, would you agree that public officials have a special responsibility to calm tensions rather than inflame them, particularly during times of social unrest? Before she could answer if she had even planned to, Kennedy pressed a button on his console. The chamber screens displayed a video from April 2018 showing Waters addressing a crowd of supporters. If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out, and you create a crowd, and you push back on them. You tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere. The video continued with Waters encouraging her supporters, we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business. Kennedy paused the video, letting the words hang in the air. Strong words from a congressional representative. Words that carry weight and consequence. Let's see some of what followed your call to action. He played a montage showing officials being harassed in restaurants, confronted at their homes, and their families being accosted at schools, all explicitly mentioning Waters' call to action as their inspiration. The footage was raw and disturbing, shouting mobs surrounding diners, frightened children being hustled through crowds of protesters, property vandalized with threatening messages. The FBI reported a 73% increase in threats against government officials in the month following your speech, Kennedy stated, displaying an official FBI report with relevant sections highlighted. Would you like to see some of the people affected by this surge in confrontational behavior? Waters found her voice, though it lacked her earlier confidence. I never intended for anyone to be harmed. I was speaking about peaceful protest, about making our voices heard in a democracy. To suggest otherwise is a distortion of my words. Kennedy paused, then played another clip of Waters from a rally 1 week after her initial comments. I have no sympathy for these people that are in this administration. I meant exactly what I said. We must make them uncomfortable wherever they are. They should not be welcome anywhere. Peaceful, Kennedy asked quietly. Let's hear from some of those affected by your calls for confrontation. The screen showed a family with young children. The father, visibly emotional, spoke directly to the camera. We were having dinner when people surrounded our table screaming at us, calling us Nazis and fascists. My 6-year-old daughter still has nightmares. They specifically mentioned Congresswoman Waters told them to do this, that they were following her instructions to make us unwelcome anywhere. The video shifted to a woman standing outside a vandalized home. They spray-painted threats on our garage door. My children couldn't go to school for a week because people were waiting outside to harass them. All because my husband works in the administration. Is this what democracy looks like to Representative Waters? Kennedy looked directly at Waters, his expression solemn. Internal emails from your office show your staff warned you about the consequences of your rhetoric, but were ignored. Your chief of staff wrote to you on April 24, 2018, "We are receiving reports of escalating situations that reference your comments. Should we issue a clarifying statement emphasizing peaceful protest?" He displayed the email exchange on screen. Waters' response read simply, "Good, that's the point. No clarification needed." The room fell silent as committee members and audience alike absorbed the implications of this exchange. Interesting contrast, Kennedy noted, displaying a split-screen comparison. On one side played videos of Waters condemning rhetoric from her opponents as dangerous and inciting violence. On the other side, her own calls for confrontation and harassment. In one particularly damning juxtaposition, Waters was shown saying, "Words matter. Leaders must be careful not to encourage violence, followed immediately by her own statement, "We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make them uncomfortable wherever they are." Waters started to interrupt, her face flushed with anger, but Kennedy was prepared for this reaction. He calmly held up a printed document. "Chairwoman, you're violating your own committee rule 5C against interrupting during evidence presentation. I have the rules right here signed by you last session. It states clearly, no member shall interrupt the presentation of evidence except on a formally recognized point of order. Since you haven't raised a point of order, I'm afraid I must continue." Several Democratic colleagues visibly winced at seeing Waters trapped by her own procedural rules once again. A few began quietly gathering their materials, preparing for a hasty exit when the opportunity presented itself. "Let me be clear." Kennedy continued, his tone measured but firm. "I believe in the First Amendment right to peaceful protest. I believe in holding government accountable. What I don't believe in is encouraging harassment of individuals and their families in private spaces, restaurants, homes, schools, places where everyone should feel safe regardless of their political affiliation." He turned to a new page in his notes. "I'd like to read a letter received by my office last month. This is from a family who had to leave their home due to threats after you personally named and targeted them during a rally in Los Angeles." Kennedy read the letter, which described in painful detail the harassment, vandalism, and ultimately the family's decision to relocate for their children's safety. The letter writer, a mid-level government employee with no policy-making role, described losing their job, their home, and their sense of security, all because Waters had singled them out as a collaborator during a heated speech. The chamber was utterly silent as Kennedy finished reading. He looked up at Waters, whose expression had shifted from defiance to discomfort. "Perhaps most troubling of all," Kennedy said softly, "are the effects on the most vulnerable." He played an interview with a tearful 10-year-old boy. "Kids at school started bullying me after Ms. Waters said my dad was a bad person on TV. They call me Nazi and fascist, and I don't even know what those words mean. I just know they're bad. I don't understand why she hates us." The child's confusion and pain were evident, his small face crumpled with incomprehension at why he had become a target of hatred. "When we call to push back and make them unwelcome anywhere," Kennedy said quietly, "these are the real people who get hurt. Not politicians with security details, not officials with protected homes, but children, families, regular people who simply happen to work for an administration you oppose." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle across the hearing room. Waters sat motionless, her once fiery demeanor completely extinguished. The attack she had launched so confidently at the beginning of the hearing now seemed like a distant memory, a miscalculation of epic proportions. "You know," Kennedy continued, his voice thoughtful, "my father used to tell me something important about power. He said, 'With great power comes great responsibility.' I think he borrowed that from somewhere, but it's true nonetheless. The words we speak as elected officials carry weight beyond what we might intend. They can inspire, or they can incite. They can heal, or they can harm." He displayed a chart showing a correlation between inflammatory political rhetoric and reported incidents of political violence over the past decade. "This isn't a partisan issue," Kennedy emphasized. "Irresponsible rhetoric exists on both sides of the aisle. The difference is in how we respond when confronted with the consequences of our words." He pulled out another document, a compilation of statements from Waters defending her calls for confrontation even after violence had occurred. In each instance, she doubled down rather than acknowledging any responsibility for the consequences. In leadership, Kennedy said, true strength lies not in doubling down on mistakes, but in having the courage to acknowledge them and change course. That's something my grandfather taught me, and it served me well over the years. Waters, for the first time since the hearing began, seemed genuinely affected not by political calculation, but by genuine reflection. Her eyes remained fixed on the image of the tearful child still frozen on the screen. Kennedy gathered his notes, closing this section of his presentation with deliberate care. I believe words matter, Chairwoman Waters. I believe leaders have a special responsibility to consider the impact of their words. And I believe that when we see the harm our words have caused, we have a moral obligation to acknowledge that harm and work to heal it. The room remained hushed. The atmosphere transformed from a political confrontation to something more profound, a moment of genuine moral reckoning. Perhaps, Kennedy suggested gently, we should move on to discuss another aspect of leadership, how we represent our country's interests on the global stage. I believe the public would find that equally illuminating. Waters nodded almost imperceptibly, still unable to meet his gaze or formulate a response. Her earlier attacks on Kennedy's character and intelligence now seemed not just miscalculated, but embarrassingly petty in light of the serious ethical questions he had raised. Kennedy opened his next folder labeled Foreign Interests and prepared for the fourth round of his methodical dismantling of Maxine Waters's political facade. Kennedy's demeanor changed again as he opened the new folder. His voice took on a tone of patriotic conviction that commanded the hearing room's attention. Public service comes with sacred obligations, he began, standing to address the committee. Each of us in this room has taken an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. We pledged to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. We swore to take this obligation freely, without mental reservation or purpose of evasion. He paused, looking directly at Waters. And we promised to well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which we were about to enter. So help us God. The invocation of the oath resonated throughout the chamber. Several committee members unconsciously straightened in their seats, reminded of the solemn promise they had all made. Chairwoman Waters, Kennedy continued, would you agree that members of Congress should never allow foreign entities to influence their decisions or use their position to benefit foreign interests over American ones? Waters nodded cautiously, clearly unsure where this was heading, but unable to disagree with such a fundamental principle. Of course, she replied, her voice barely audible. Then, perhaps you can explain these, Kennedy said, signaling for the display to change. The screen filled with a complex diagram of financial transactions color-coded and spanning multiple countries. These documents show contributions from foreign corporations and government-affiliated entities to foundations directly linked to your political activities. The diagram was meticulously organized, showing money flowing from various international sources through a labyrinth of shell companies, consultancies, and nonprofits before ultimately reaching organizations under Waters' direct or indirect control. Waters looked genuinely confused, or at least put on a convincing show of confusion. That's impossible. Foreign contributions to political campaigns are illegal. I would never accept such funds. Kennedy slapped his hand on the table, the sudden sharp sound making several people jump. Exactly. That's precisely the issue, Chairwoman Waters. It should be impossible, but it happened anyway. He walked to the front of the dais, commanding the room's attention. Let me walk the committee through what our investigation uncovered. This isn't about direct campaign contributions that would be too obvious. This is about a sophisticated network, designed specifically to obscure the source of funds while ensuring they benefit your political operations and personal interests. The screen displayed a closer view of the flow chart, highlighting specific entities in the network. Between 2017 and 2022, over $2.7 million moved through this network, Kennedy explained, using a laser pointer to trace the path of funds. All originating from foreign sources, including state-owned enterprises in China, private corporations with ties to the Russian government, and sovereign wealth funds from Middle Eastern nations. He focused on one particular pathway. This entity, Global Progress Initiative, received $840,000 from a Hong Kong-based investment firm with direct ties to the Chinese Communist Party. GPI then transferred $825,000 to the American Economic Opportunity Foundation, which happens to be chaired by your former Chief of Staff. That foundation then provided $795,000 in consulting services to Progressive Partnerships, a company owned by your husband. Kennedy turned to face Waters directly. Money laundering is defined as concealing the origin of funds obtained through illicit means. This structure appears designed for precisely that purpose, to conceal the foreign origin of these funds while ensuring they ultimately benefit your political and personal interests. Waters shook her head vehemently. This is a witch hunt. You have no authority to make these unfounded allegations. This is a political attack meant to— Interesting choice of words, Kennedy interrupted, his tone thoughtful rather than confrontational. That's exactly the phrase you criticized your opponents for using last year when they faced similar questions about financial improprieties. In fact, you said, he consulted his notes, the witch hunt defense is the last refuge of the guilty used when evidence becomes too damning to refute directly. A murmur ran through the gallery as Kennedy quoted Waters' own words against her. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The Louisiana senator continued his methodical exposition. Let's be crystal clear about what we're discussing. This isn't about legitimate international business dealings. This is about foreign governments and entities with explicit interests before your committee funneling money to benefit you while concealing the source of those funds. The gallery murmured as Kennedy continued, some of Waters' few remaining supporters exchanging uncomfortable glances. Now I'd like to welcome another special guest today. Kennedy gestured toward the door, where a serious-looking man in a dark suit entered. This is former FBI Special Agent Thomas Rivera, who specialized in political corruption cases before his retirement last year. Rivera approached the witness table with measured steps. After being sworn in, he addressed the committee with the calm confidence of a seasoned professional. I have reviewed the financial documents presented by Senator Kennedy. Based on my 27 years of experience investigating public corruption and foreign influence operations, I can confirm that these financial pathways are consistent with those used to circumvent campaign finance laws and conceal foreign influence. The pattern of layered transactions through seemingly unrelated entities, followed by consulting contracts with no deliverables, is a classic method of disguising the true source and destination of funds. He continued his testimony, devastating in its professional detachment. These specific transaction patterns match those I investigated in 3 major foreign influence cases during my career at the Bureau. I can confirm that similar financial structures are currently under investigation by the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, though I cannot comment on specific ongoing investigations. Waters lost her composure entirely. This is outrageous. You have no right to ambush me with these unfounded allegations. This entire hearing has been nothing but a setup. Kennedy remained calm amid Waters' outburst. No ambush, Chairwoman. Just facts. Let's look at your voting record in relation to these payments, shall we? I think the timing might interest the committee. The screen displayed a timeline correlating foreign payments with Waters' position changes on key legislation. Before receiving these funds from Chinese-connected sources, You strongly opposed the Central American Trade Agreement, citing concerns about labor standards and environmental protections, Kennedy noted. 2 weeks after this $300,000 payment from a Panamanian shell corporation, ultimately connected to Chinese state interests, you became a vocal supporter. Quite a dramatic change of heart. Kennedy methodically displayed Waters's contradictory statements side by side, first opposing, then supporting the exact same policies after receiving payments through the network he had exposed. The pattern was unmistakable and damning. In February 2019, you opposed sanctions on certain Russian banks, calling them counterproductive to peace efforts, Kennedy continued. In March 2019, $450,000 flowed through this network from a Cypriot entity connected to Russian oligarchs. By April 2019, you were actively working to block those same sanctions, calling them harmful to international diplomacy. With each example, the evidence grew more compelling. The correlation between foreign payments and policy shifts was too consistent to be coincidental. Democratic colleagues began quietly leaving the hearing room, not wanting to be associated with what was unfolding. Only 3 Democratic committee members remained, all carefully avoiding eye contact with Waters. Perhaps most concerning, Kennedy said, his voice grave, are these communications between foreign officials discussing their investment in American politicians. He displayed emails obtained through intelligence sources, carefully redacted to protect methods and sources, but with the key passages highlighted. Our financial arrangement with Congresswoman W. has proven effective. Her committee position provides invaluable leverage on trade matters. Recommend increasing support through established channels. The recent policy shift on sanctions demonstrates good return on investment. Continue payments through the Hong Kong route to maintain plausible deniability. Waters stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. Whether shocked by the existence of such communications or simply by their public revelation was impossible to determine. "Oh, and this just arrived this morning," Kennedy said, holding up an official letter with the congressional seal. "The Ethics Committee has formally opened an investigation based on this evidence. I believe you received a copy approximately 30 minutes ago, though perhaps you haven't had time to review it, given the intensity of today's hearing." Waters now, with only a handful of staffers remaining beside her, struggled to maintain her composure. Her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled papers before her, not actually reading them, but needing some activity to mask her distress. "Chairwoman Waters," Kennedy said, his Louisiana drawl returning slightly, "there's a saying back home, when you dig a hole for someone else, don't dig too deep, or you might not be able to climb out. You dug quite a hole when you started this hearing today." He gathered his notes methodically, allowing the implications of his presentation to settle across the chamber. The contrast with Waters' opening attack could not have been more stark, where she had relied on personal insults and theatrics. Kennedy had presented documented evidence and testimony. "You know," Kennedy continued, his tone almost conversational now, "I wasn't planning to discuss any of this today. I came prepared to talk about banking regulations as the hearing notice suggested. But when you chose to make this personal, to attack my character and integrity without provocation, it seemed appropriate to examine those same qualities in your own record." The chamber was eerily quiet as Kennedy prepared for his final revelation. "Now," he said, opening his last folder with deliberate care, "let's discuss what matters most, the people we serve and the principles we uphold." Kennedy stood up, removed his suit jacket, and folded it carefully over his chair. He took off his reading glasses and tucked them into his pocket. When he spoke again, all traces of his exaggerated Southern persona were gone. "I'm not here to destroy you, Representative Waters," he said with unexpected gentleness. I'm only interested in the truth being told." Waters looked up, visibly surprised by this shift. Kennedy reached into his briefcase and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook. "This is a journal I began keeping 5 years ago," he explained, opening it to reveal meticulous handwritten notes. "I started documenting patterns of behavior that concerned me not as a Republican looking to damage a Democrat, but as a public servant, worried about the integrity of our institutions." He held up several emails. "These are messages I sent to your office, attempting to discuss these issues privately. All went unanswered." Waters looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. "I never wanted this public confrontation," Kennedy continued. "I believe problems should be solved quietly through dialogue and mutual respect. But when dialogue is repeatedly rejected, sometimes public accountability becomes necessary." Kennedy walked to the witness table and pressed play on a new video compilation, this time showing residents from Waters District speaking directly to the camera. An elderly woman with gray hair spoke first. "I've voted for her for 30 years. Now she doesn't even know my name." A young business owner appeared next. "Our neighborhood is falling apart, but she only shows up when CNN cameras are here." A teacher, a pastor, and a nurse followed, all expressing similar sentiments of abandonment and betrayal. As the video ended, Kennedy did something unexpected. Instead of demanding Waters' resignation or calling for her censure, he unveiled a 10-point plan for strengthening transparency in political finances. "This isn't about parties," he said. "It's about serving the people who elected us." Waters, who had prepared for a call for her resignation, looked genuinely confused by this turn of events. Kennedy's voice softened as he shared a personal story. "My father was a small-town bank clerk, not an important man by Washington standards, but a man of unshakable integrity. He taught me that public service is the greatest privilege, not the greatest power." For the first time that day, Waters showed genuine emotion, her eyes momentarily glistening. Kennedy concluded with an unexpected offer. "Representative Waters, we may be political opponents, but we share the same responsibility to the American people. I'm not seeking to end your career. I'm hoping to remind all of us why we're here." He extended a symbolic olive branch. "Perhaps we could work together on these reforms, show the American people that accountability transcends partisanship." Waters, caught completely off guard by this show of grace, after such a thorough dismantling, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. As the hearing concluded, Kennedy gathered his papers without fanfare. "My grandmother had one more saying I'd like to share. Even the strongest storm eventually gives way to sunshine. I hope we can find some sunshine after this storm for the good of the people we serve." Chaos erupted as the hearing adjourned. The hallway outside the committee room became a frenzied marketplace of information, with reporters shoving microphones toward anyone who had witnessed the extraordinary confrontation. Cameras flashed continuously as committee members emerged, each instantly surrounded by press, seeking comment on what many were already calling the most consequential congressional hearing in decades. Kennedy politely declined to comment as he made his way through the crowd, stating only, "The evidence speaks for itself. My interest is in reform, not retribution." Despite persistent questioning, he remained composed and refused to gloat or elaborate, maintaining the same dignified demeanor he had displayed throughout the hearing. "Senator Kennedy, do you think Representative Waters should resign?" shouted a reporter from CNN. Kennedy paused briefly. "That's not my decision to make. My concern is with improving the system, not punishing individuals." "But after all the evidence you presented," the reporter persisted, "Everyone deserves the opportunity to correct their course," Kennedy replied, "including Representative Waters, if she chooses to do so." With that, he continued walking his staff, creating a protective buffer as he made his way toward his office. Meanwhile, Waters remained in the committee room long after most had departed, consulting with her attorney and remaining staff members. When she finally emerged, she looked visibly aged, the confident firebrand of the morning, replaced by a subdued, contemplative figure. She too declined to speak with reporters, hurrying to a waiting vehicle that quickly disappeared into the DC traffic. Within hours, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. #Kennedy's Waters and Bayou Justice dominated social media, with clips of the exchange being viewed millions of times. The video of Waters' opening attack, juxtaposed with Kennedy's methodical dismantling of her record, became the most shared political content of the year. News networks ran with headlines like "Kennedy flips the script" and "Waters meets her match in Louisiana Senator." "What we witnessed today was political jiu-jitsu at its finest," observed a political analyst on MSNBC. Waters initiated what she thought would be a career-defining takedown of Kennedy, only to find herself completely outmaneuvered. Kennedy allowed her to overextend herself, then systematically dismantled her credibility with actual evidence rather than personal attacks. CNN's chief political correspondent noted, "Kennedy essentially created a masterclass in how to respond to political character assassination. He never raised his voice, never resorted to personal insults, and never strayed from the facts. It was devastating precisely because it was so measured and evidence-based." By evening, several Democratic colleagues had issued carefully worded statements distancing themselves from Waters. "The allegations raised today deserve serious investigation," said the House Majority Leader, notably absent any defense of Waters herself. "Our party remains committed to ethical governance and transparency." Behind closed doors, Democratic leadership was reportedly furious, not just at the revelations, but at Waters' handling of the entire situation. "She walked into a trap of her own making," a senior Democratic strategist told Politico. "She turned what should have been a routine hearing into a personal vendetta, and got absolutely demolished in the process. The damage to her personally, and to the party more broadly, is incalculable." Kennedy returned to Louisiana the following day, declining the national media circuit despite numerous lucrative offers. When cornered by a local reporter at the Baton Rouge airport, he shrugged off questions about his victory. "I didn't win anything," he said, adjusting his worn leather briefcase. "This isn't a game. These are serious issues that deserve serious attention." When asked if he had planned the confrontation in advance, Kennedy smiled slightly. "Well, as the saying goes, chance favors the prepared mind. I believe in doing my homework." Back in Washington, Waters canceled her scheduled appearances for the week, citing a need to review committee matters. Her once active social media accounts fell silent, with staffers quietly removing the clips of her opening attack on Kennedy that had aged so poorly in light of what followed. 1 week later, the House Ethics Committee formally announced an investigation into Waters' financial disclosures and potential conflicts of interest. The committee's statement emphasized that the investigation would be thorough, fair, and expeditious, though political observers noted the unusual speed with which the inquiry had been initiated, a reflection of the seriousness of the evidence Kennedy had presented. Several former allies publicly called for transparency, with one senior Democrat telling CNN, "If there's nothing to hide, then cooperation with the investigation should be complete and immediate. Our credibility as a party depends on holding ourselves to the same standards we demand of others." Kennedy continued his regular Senate work, refusing to comment further on the Waters situation, despite daily media inquiries. In a brief interview with Louisiana Public Broadcasting, he said simply, "I did what needed to be done. Now it's time to get back to serving the people of Louisiana." In her district, Waters faced a dramatically different reception than she was accustomed to. At a previously scheduled community meeting, several constituents directly confronted her with questions raised in Kennedy's presentation. The normally combative representative adopted an uncharacteristically conciliatory tone, promising to listen more and do better for her community. Waters maintained a low profile, nationally canceling several scheduled cable news appearances. Her office issued a statement calling the allegations politically motivated, but noticeably lacking specific denials of Kennedy's claims. Political analysts noted the statement's carefully crafted language, which addressed the political motivation rather than the substantive evidence. "She's in damage control mode," noted a veteran political consultant. The problem is, Kennedy presented such specific documented evidence that traditional deflection tactics aren't working. She's facing the toughest challenge of her political career. 1 month later, in a move that shocked Washington, Waters announced she would cooperate with Kennedy's proposed reforms. "While I dispute many of the characterizations made during the hearing," her statement read, "I believe increasing transparency in government finances benefits everyone. This is an opportunity to strengthen public trust in our institutions." The announcement caused immediate speculation about what had prompted this unexpected cooperation. Some suggested it was a calculated move to rehabilitate her image, while others wondered if additional evidence might be forthcoming that would make opposition untenable. Even more surprising was the news of a private meeting between Waters and Kennedy at a neutral Capitol Hill location. No staff were present, and neither party commented publicly on what was discussed. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, according to those who observed Waters arriving and departing. Sources close to Waters indicated she had acknowledged some missteps, though not the full extent of Kennedy's allegations. One aide, speaking anonymously, described her as reflective following the meeting, saying she had been genuinely affected by the testimony from constituents in her district. Kennedy, true to form, refused to divulge details of their conversation, telling a persistent reporter only that constructive dialogue is always preferable to public confrontation. Representative Waters and I had a productive discussion about moving forward in a way that benefits the American people. The meeting sparked rumors of an unlikely alliance forming between the conservative Louisiana senator and the progressive California representative, an odd couple brought together by a shared interest in ethics reform, albeit through very different paths. 3 months later, the Kennedy-Waters Financial Transparency Act was introduced with bipartisan co-sponsors, surprising even seasoned political observers who had expected Waters to fade into obscurity following the hearing. The legislation proposed stringent new disclosure requirements for all members of Congress, with particular focus on family business connections and foreign influences. "This is not a partisan issue," Kennedy said at the press conference announcing the bill. "Americans deserve to know that their elected representatives are working for them, not for foreign interests or personal enrichment." Waters stood alongside Kennedy at the announcement, a visual that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. "Transparency and accountability strengthen our democracy," she stated, reading carefully from prepared remarks. "While Senator Kennedy and I disagree on many policy issues, we agree that public service must be just that service to the public." While skeptics saw the partnership as political theater designed to salvage Waters' reputation, others recognized it as a rare example of constructive engagement across the partisan divide. Waters began appearing more frequently in her district, hosting town halls and meeting with community leaders. Local residents reported mixed feelings, appreciation for the renewed attention, coupled with skepticism about its durability. "She's definitely more present than before," said a community activist in Inglewood. But we've seen promises before. The question is whether this change will last beyond the current scrutiny. Kennedy consistently deflected credit for the legislation, insisting the system is correcting itself. When pressed about his confrontation with Waters, he would only say, "That's water under the bridge. We're looking forward now, not backward." Political analysts noted the remarkable transformation in both politicians' public personas. Waters, more constituency-focused and less combative. Kennedy, more policy-oriented and less reliant on his folksy persona. What we're seeing is two seasoned politicians adapting to a changed landscape, observed a political science professor at Georgetown. Waters is rebuilding her image through substantive work, rather than rhetorical battles, while Kennedy is leveraging his newfound national prominence to advance policy priorities rather than personal ambition. 1 year later, the Kennedy-Waters Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, a rarity in the polarized political environment. The bill was hailed as the most significant ethics reform in a generation, establishing new standards for financial disclosure, foreign contact reporting, and constituent service metrics. At the signing ceremony, Kennedy and Waters stood on opposite sides of the president, but exchanged a brief, respectful nod. Observers noted that while certainly not friends, they had developed a working relationship based on mutual respect, something few would have predicted after their explosive confrontation. This legislation proves that adversity can sometimes produce unexpected collaboration, the president remarked at the signing. Senator Kennedy and Representative Waters have shown that accountability and reform can transcend partisan differences. Waters' district began showing signs of improvement through targeted federal programs she helped secure. Without directly acknowledging past neglect, she spoke of a renewed commitment to hands-on representation and made constituent services a priority. Her quarterly town halls became a regular feature in the community calendar, and her staff established a dashboard tracking casework and community project implementation. Kennedy received praise from unexpected quarters, with a prominent liberal columnist writing, "Kennedy demonstrated something rare in politics, the ability to hold an opponent accountable without seeking their destruction. He led with principles rather than punishment, offering a path to redemption rather than political exile." 2 years later, the political landscape had shifted dramatically since the hearing. Waters' district showed measurable improvements in economic indicators and community development. Though still a progressive Democrat, she had moderated her rhetoric and focused more intensely on constituent services than national political battles. Kennedy and Waters had become unlikely partners on several bipartisan initiatives, focusing particularly on financial regulations that protected consumers while promoting transparency. Their working relationship, forged in the aftermath of bitter confrontation, became a model cited by advocates of bipartisan cooperation. In a rare personal interview with Vanity Fair, Waters reflected, "Sometimes you need a wake-up call to see yourself clearly. I won't say I agreed with everything that happened that day, but it forced me to reassess my priorities. Public service is supposed to be about the public, not about the servant." Kennedy, interviewed separately for the same article, was characteristically measured. "None of us are perfect. We all have blind spots. The mark of character isn't never making mistakes. It's how you respond when those mistakes are revealed." Both politicians saw their approval ratings rise, albeit for different reasons. Waters was viewed as having grown from adversity, while Kennedy was seen as principled but compassionate, willing to hold power accountable without seeking personal destruction. Final scene. Kennedy sat on the dock behind his Louisiana home, fishing, with his 8-year-old grandson. The late afternoon sun glinted off the bayou water as they waited patiently for a bite. The senator appeared completely at peace worlds away from the political battlefield of Washington. His phone rang, Waters calling to discuss details of their newest legislative proposal, addressing predatory lending practices. After a brief, cordial conversation, Kennedy hung up. "Was that the lady from the video, Grandpa?" his grandson asked. "The one you had the big fight with? I thought she was the bad guy." Kennedy smiled thoughtfully. "Nobody's all good or all bad, son. In politics like fishing, sometimes you have to be patient, know when to reel in and when to give some slack." Looking out across the Louisiana bayou, he continued, "And sometimes the biggest fish are the ones you thought had gotten away." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the wisdom in his grandfather's words. That evening, Kennedy penned an essay for his local paper, reflecting on responsibility, forgiveness, and reform. The goal of accountability is never destruction, but improvement. We don't point out flaws to tear down, but to build up stronger than before. In Louisiana, we know that after every hurricane comes the opportunity to rebuild better. Public service isn't about winning arguments or defeating opponents. It's about remembering who we serve and why. If the recent reforms help restore even a small measure of public trust in our institutions, then the difficulties were worthwhile. As my father used to say, character isn't how you act when everyone's watching. It's what you do when you think no one is. In Washington, someone is always watching, but true integrity comes from within. Kennedy concluded with a call for unity and public service, with integrity, a message that resonated far beyond Louisiana and far beyond partisan politics. As for Maxine Waters, she continued serving her district with a renewed focus and humility that surprised even her harshest critics. The confrontation that she had initiated as a political assassination had instead become a catalyst for her own redemption story, an outcome neither she nor Kennedy could have predicted when she launched her attack that fateful morning. Sometimes, as Kennedy might say in his Louisiana drawl, the good Lord works in mysterious ways. And sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones we plan, but the ones that find us when we stand firmly on principle and truth. 5 years later, the Kennedy-Waters reforms had transformed the landscape of congressional ethics. Financial disclosure requirements had exposed and prevented numerous conflicts of interest. Foreign influence had diminished significantly, as the pathways for concealing it were systematically closed. Most importantly, a new culture of accountability had taken root in both parties. Kennedy, now chairman of the powerful Senate Banking Committee, had expanded his reform efforts to Wall Street regulations, bringing the same meticulous preparation and evidence-based approach that had characterized his confrontation with Waters. Waters, in her final term before retirement, had become an unlikely champion for constituent services and community development. Her district, once neglected, now boasted some of the most innovative urban renewal programs in the country. Though she never fully acknowledged all the allegations Kennedy had raised, her actions spoke louder than any confession could have. At a congressional retirement dinner honoring Waters, Kennedy was invited to speak a gesture that would have seemed unthinkable years earlier. "Representative Waters and I have traveled a unique path," Kennedy told the assembled dignitaries. "It began with confrontation, but led to collaboration. It started with accountability, but ended with accomplishment. And while we still disagree on many issues, we agree on the most important one, that public service must always put the public first." Waters, in her response, acknowledged Kennedy with unexpected warmth. "Senator Kennedy taught me a valuable lesson about representation," she said. "Sometimes our harshest critics become our most important teachers. Our democracy is stronger when accountability transcends partisanship." As the evening concluded, Kennedy and Waters shared a brief conversation away from the cameras and microphones. "You know," Kennedy said quietly, "that day in the hearing room, I wasn't sure how things would end." "Neither was I," Waters admitted. "But I'm glad they ended this way." They shook hands not as political opponents, not even as reluctant allies, but as two public servants who had found common ground in the most unlikely of circumstances. Back in Louisiana, a week later, Kennedy sat on his porch swing contemplating his own eventual retirement. The phone rang a reporter seeking comment on Waters' legacy as she prepared to leave Congress. "How should history remember Maxine Waters?" the reporter asked. Kennedy considered the question carefully. History should remember that even in our most difficult moments, redemption is possible. It should remember that accountability without compassion is just vengeance, and that true leadership means offering a path forward, not just pointing out where someone has gone wrong. He paused, then added, "Most of all, history should remember that in American politics, the story is never over until the final vote is cast." Maxine Waters's finest chapter came after what many thought would be her last. That's a lesson worth remembering. As Kennedy hung up the phone, he smiled at the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. What had begun as a confrontation had evolved into one of the most productive bipartisan relationships in modern political history. It wasn't the path either of them would have chosen, but perhaps it was the path they both needed. In Washington, a framed copy of the Kennedy-Waters Act hung in the Capitol Visitor Center, a testament to what can happen when accountability meets redemption, when principle meets pragmatism, and when two political opponents find the courage to put the public good above personal grudges. Beneath the frame, a simple inscription read, "From confrontation comes clarity. From accountability comes improvement. From adversity comes opportunity." Words that both Kennedy and Waters had come to live by, though through very different journeys to the same destination.